Hey guys, Bartell's Bookshelf here with my semi-mid-February wrap-up. Um, got four books to talk about here. One's kind of a technicality because it's part of an omnibus, but I'm counting it. So yeah, that's basically four books read so far this month, so I'm really happy about that. And gonna try not to waffle on too much, so let's just get into it. Uh, First book I read was Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is a very, very famous book. I mean, you've probably at least heard about this, seen it around. This really blew the hell up on TikTok, I believe, a few years ago, and it got reprinted by Tor, and it actually won the Hugo that year, 2022. Yeah, 2022. And my friend Laura is really, really into this. She read this, loved it, bought all the books. There's two sequels. And this basically kind of unlocked the whole cozy romance genre, not just for her, but for kind of the world at large. And stuff like that always intrigues me, kind of trendsetters and the stuff that really kind of blows up out of nowhere, and it feels sort of organic and just I don't know. I'm always fascinated with stuff like that, so I wanted to check this out, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. So this is as I mentioned, cozy fantasy romance about a retired barbarian orc named Viv, and she decides to settle in this city called Thune, and she's basically planning to start a coffee shop. And in this world, coffee is like a dwarven thing. It's very sort of specialized. Not a lot of people know about it yet. And she's kind of hoping to introduce it to the world at large to kind of share the love, And she hires this succubus named Tandri to be her sort of barista. And feelings sort of start to develop between them amongst sort of the trials and tribulations of opening a coffee shop in this fantasy world. My sort of issue with sort of cozy romance or cozy anything really, when I first sort of heard about it, was I was sort of worried it would be boring, like nothing happens. Not that I need, constant action in my books or anything like that. I'm not that type of reader, but there's a fine line between cozy and boring, as similar to what I say about quiet horror and boring horror. I was worried it would kind of be something like that, but it was very, very pleasant. It goes into a surprising amount of detail into what it would actually take to open a shop sort of within the confines of this universe. The way that they sort of adapt a lot of kind of modern ideas, not that coffee's modern, but the modern idea of a coffee shop with baristas and brewing machines and that type of thing. My main worry was that, as I say, it was sort of going to be kind of boring and because it's cozy, it's low stakes. So I thought it was just kind of going to be everyone's just kind of unreasonably nice to each other. You're just sort of bland and generically sort of happy and pleasant, and that would be a little bit of a hard sell for me. But it's really not like that at all. It really is just sort of I guess you can kind of look at it as what happens to the main character after their big adventure, when they decide to settle down, I mean, you always hear, in fantasy books, you always run into sort of side characters who maybe, were retired, they used to go on adventures and now they're kind of, running a tavern or something like that, and this is sort of the story behind that, behind what might just be kind of a side character in another fantasy book, And while it's low stakes, there are stakes. There are, trials and tribulations that Viv runs into, not just with running the shop, but with her relationship with Tandri. You get a lot of the sense of Viv's backstory, of where she came from, and of her old sort of adventuring party and the reasons that she felt that she wanted to get out of the business and stuff like that. Her romance with Tandri is very, very slow burn, and there's no spice, obviously, but it's very, very sweet. Very organic, I thought. Didn't feel forced or anything like that. And the main thing that I was sort of fascinated by, as I said earlier, was kind of just getting a sense of the process of getting this thing going, of sort of the planning and what it would take to actually build these things, and kind of thinking through the logistics of running a business. I mean, it sounds boring, but the way it's presented in the book, it's very meticulous and calculated, and I thought it was really fascinating for that, especially within the context of this fantasy universe where they're kind of dealing with things that traditionally don't really exist in fantasy universes usually. And along the way, and the thing that I think is sort of very endearing about it is that it's cozy in the sense that, as I say, it's low stakes, not a lot sort of, there's not a lot of sort of forward momentum and big action and stuff, but there is this sense of of community building between the characters as she gathers employees and sort of starts to pick up other, sort of a, clientele. The people that she works with to actually rebuild this horse stable, this livery, into a coffee shop. She meets this little hob named Cal, short for Calamity, and he's just really cute. He's like this sort of grizzled, sort of woodworker type, very taciturn. She meets this ratkin named Thimble, who is very quiet, very kind of keeps to himself, but he's an amazing baker. And there's just this growing sense of like sort of like-minded people kind of coming together and like forming something greater than themselves, and serving and providing a service to the people around them, and kind of. There's a sense of kind of creating this little sort of island of sort of contentment and kindness, and that's kind of reflected through the characters and the events in the story as well, and that's a kind of a recurring theme of the story, because Viv is tired of this life of, violence and conflict and death and anger and rage, and so she's looking for a way out, and this is her way out, and I just thought it was I don't know, it was all just very beautifully done, and it was nice to read something where, like I say, like, the characters are nice, but they're not bland, you know what I mean? Like, that's kind of the risk you run into with this kind of thing, and it's not like that at all, the characters all feel distinct, they're interesting, there is conflict, it's just not in the way that we would think, and the dialogue itself, there's a lot of, like, banter, especially between her and Tawdry, and the banter is very kind of, like, subtle and kind of witty and sort of not snarky, but it's just sort of very, wink and a nod, It reminded me, in a lot of ways, of sort of the irreverent sort of fantasy of Terry Pratchett, with a mix of sort of the dry wit of, like, P.G. Wodehouse, which is really interesting. Obviously, it's not as acidic or biting as Terry Pratchett, and it's not as, laugh out loud funny and, and crazy witty as like P.G. Wodehouse, but it's not a world away. It was it's a very, as I say, it's a very sort of low stakes, calm, cozy sort of amalgamation of these things, and I thought it was a really beautiful story. I really, really liked it. I don't know if I loved it as much as everybody else did. I think it's easier to like than it is to love for me, but it's very sweet, it's very pleasant, it's fun to read, it's an easy read. It's very comforting, very cozy. So yeah, if you enjoy that kind of thing, if that sounds interesting, I would check it out. In the paperback editions, there's actually a prequel story that was also very interesting that, kind of delves into a lot of the same themes of sort of leaving behind violence and stuff like that, and you get a little more of a sense of like her old group that she used to pal around with, and I really liked them in the book, what we got of them, so it was nice to get a little more of that. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. Really liked that. Next, I read Green Dot by Madeleine Gray. This is a library book. So this is just a completely random find. I just read an article about it on The Guardian, because she's coming out, the author Madeleine Gray is coming out with a new book, and I just read this interview that she wrote where she just talked a lot about sort of being a queer writer and like addressing themes of like queerness in her book, and there was a lot of talk about what a bit popular book this was and how it kind of came out of nowhere, and I was intrigued by it, so I picked it up from the library because it just happened to be there, and I loved this. I was surprised how much I really enjoyed this, because on the face of it, it doesn't seem like something I would immediately be into. It's sort of a dramedy about this young woman named Hera, this young queer woman who she's kind of, very depressed, kind of aimless, moving from place. She's staying with her father, but in terms of, just her state of mind, she's kind of going from place to place. And she ends up getting a job at this newspaper, and her job is to basically, like, moderate comments. And, it's very kind of mind-numbing work. It's very, like, draining emotionally and stuff like that. And she meets the guy who works across the table from her, who's this older, middle-aged man named Arthur, who's a journalist. And she ends up being very, very attracted to him. She usually prefers women, but she has had experiences with men before, and she just has this very intense emotional relationship with him that ends up being an affair, because she doesn't realize when they first hook up that he's married. So again, this is an affair book. Sort of, I hate this term, but some people might call it chick lit. Which isn't usually my type of thing, but it just sounded interesting, and I picked it up, and man, I'm glad I did, because this is great. And the main thing about it that you'll probably hear a lot of people talk about in other reviews is that it's just funny. It is such a funny book. It's not, sort of like it's not, like jokes, mile a minute, sarcasm, that type of thing. It's just very biting and witty, and the narrator's voice, Hera's voice, is just so like caustic and just sort of like sarcastic and just that kind of like tired millennial, like vibe, that very relatable for me. And just it's just beautifully written, it's just so crisp and cutting and witty. The emotions that it delves into are well articulated without devolving into sort of melodrama. You could open like any page of the book and just find something funny, like so if I don't have the mortgage to tell me to spawn, then what will tell me to? Feelings of inadequacy as a woman? Boredom when all my friends are busy going to play dates and I'm alone on a Saturday afternoon? And what would I be able to give to a child anyway? I don't even mean that in an eco-conscious way, though people my age who are morally superior to me are deciding to be childless for this reason. The planet is dying. I don't not know this, and I have thought about it. I'm not immune to the discourse. It's just that I really don't think that my one child, or maybe two, is going to hasten the end of the Earth in any discernible way when billionaires are still flying to space to fill their existential voids. And it's just full of stuff like that. Like, I actually took some pictures of one because it just made me laugh so much. Yeah, so this is she ends up IMing with another coworker of hers about another coworker. She tells her, you get used to her and everything. She says, how long will it take until that happens, do you think? A pause. Dots pop up. Dots disappear. Ping, Mei Ling Chen. You just have to wait until you give up on all of your dreams, and then everything becomes a lot easier. The moment will come. Have faith. Oh my god. Oh my god. Mei Ling is funny. Mei Ling is funny and depressed. My two favorite things in a potential friend. I am beaming. I am floating. Mei Ling, you saucy devil, you sly dog. You also hate this. And there was another bit that I really liked. Not one of my new colleagues knows about my romantic situation because I really don't want to have to explain to everyone that my partner is someone else's partner. They all think I'm single, and so are constantly trying to set me up with their housemates, lauding Bill's pasta-making prowess or Tina's bouldering strength. Bisexuality is a curse in this way. You must fend off double the terrible setups. So it's just full of kind of that sort of very dry, sardonic, just caustic humor that really just made it a pleasure to read. I mean, it's just so wonderful when you can pick up a book that's just like, man, it's an author who's like in control of language and tone in a way that just feels so self-assured. And the fact that this was a debut novel, I was just like shocked by. The thing is, like, you hear about it, sort of like an office romance or affair type thing, and you think it's going to be very like melodramatic and sort of like depressing. And there's moments of that. It doesn't shy away from sort of the true sort of emotional devastation of a relationship like this, but it's almost like sort of dealing with it through humor, And I think a lot of the things that it says about sort of, affairs and relationships of that type of thing and sort of the things that drive people to relationships like that, I thought was very truthful. And it ended in a way that I thought also was very truthful to the themes of the book. One of the things that I sort of struggled with at first was I felt like Hera was putting a little bit too much onus on Arthur. And obviously, he is sort of the older man. He's the married one. It's more of the power imbalance. But she blames him for a lot of sort of the emotional devastation when she's kind of responsible for a lot of it herself. As I always say, it takes two to tango. But the more that I thought about it, the more that I sort of realized I think that's intentional. I think it's about, her own blind spots and the deficiencies within herself that led her to this relationship. And she cops to some of that, but none of us are completely, fully self-aware of what we do and what we're capable of. So I think, of course, she does have that blind spot, and I just thought it made it more realistic that way. Not a whole lot much more to say about it. I just think, as I say, there's not really like a plot as such, like a lot of sort of literary type books. It's more just about the interactions between the characters and the emotions they're going through and things like that. I just thought it was really well written, just beautifully done, incredibly funny. I definitely really want to read her next book, which deals with a lesbian woman. And I think it also deals with an affair or some sort of emotional devastation. So I'm very curious. It's cool to see sort of queer stories where we're not sort of perfectly perfect individuals. We're allowed to be flawed and make mistakes and screw up just like straights and everybody else. It's very refreshing to see. So yeah, that was a great book. That was a pleasant surprise. Very glad I read that. Then, because it is February and it is Holmes is Where the Heart Is, with a ton of co-hosts, I'll link them all like I did in the previous video. But I mentioned because of that, I've been reading Sherlock Holmes, the complete Sherlock Holmes, about halfway through Volume 1. talking about this because I just finished the first short story collection, which is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which I believe was, well, the stories were originally published from 1890 to 1891, I believe. The book edition was published in 1892. So, yeah, just going to talk about that as my little Holmes is where the heart is contribution. So, yeah, this was great. I mean, I talked about it a little bit in my previous video, but I'm just now getting into Sherlock Holmes. Somehow I've never read any of the books or stories till now. I know, it's a blind spot I've always been ashamed of. But man, like, these are just so much fun. Even if, like, all of the mysteries kind of aren't really that interesting, or, you know, the conclusions feel a bit, like, contrived and stuff like that. As I mentioned in my previous video, what saves them is the characterization between Holmes and Watson. You know, sort of the average guy, sort of the straight man, to, you know, Holmes's, you know, sort of eccentricity and sort of arrogance. And I just love sort of how contradictory Holmes can be, you know, where he puts on airs of being sort of very logical and sort of disconnected, but then he has moments of, like, real, like, pain and, like, and anguish. You know, there's a lot going on up here, you get the impression of. I mean, of course there is, but he's not just some sort of, like, logical, computery machine man, you know? There was one bit that I really, really liked. I can't remember what story it was in now, but, they go to the countryside to investigate, you know, this home that's, you know, where some weird stuff's been going on, and he's looking around at all of these sort of little houses, and he's sort of lamenting to himself about, you know, oh, Watson, you know, people don't realize all of the sadness and the potential for violence and crime that hides behind these, like, sort of pleasant exteriors, you know, and stuff like that, or like, you know, he'll, like, be, like, observing a jewel and sort of pontificating on sort of, you know, what drives men to crime, you know, like how there can be so much devastation wrought by just this tiny little stone, you know, and things like that. That are just really kind of surprisingly kind of romantic and poetic coming from him, you know, and just kind of the surprises that he can offer because of that, you know, which, like, Watson comments on. But yeah, these are all really, really entertaining stories. My favorite was probably Adventure of the Speckled Band. There's this whole adventure where they go to this house and they're trying to figure out what killed this woman in this bedroom. So they have to spend the night in the bedroom with everyone completely unaware of their presence, in total darkness, with, you know, Holmes and Watson kind of, like, this close to each other, you know, just kind of sitting and breathing, and it's just so full of tension the way that it's described, you know, just imagining just the pure, like, terror of, like, sitting there in pitch darkness in the countryside, you know, just nothing but just ambient sounds around you, kind of listening for any moment of danger, you know. It's really, really well done. And that's the thing that also really surprised me about these, is that, you know, not having a ton of experience at this point with Conan Doyle, he was really, like, propulsive and very, like, forward-moving, you know. I mean, I can see why people really liked these stories, because they're just great entertainments, you know. They move at a clip, and just, again, there's just kind of this dry sort of British wit, especially on the side of Holmes, that just makes it just fun to read, you know, and especially as I say, on the part of Holmes, the sardonic wit and kind of the sarcasm and just the banter that kind of comes from him, it just sort of oozes, you know, sort of cool, and there's just this sort of ease to it, and the writing feels like that too. There's just this smooth easiness to it, you know, where it's just so fun to read. And as I say, the action scenes are surprisingly tense too. You know, you think it's all going to be like investigation and stuff like that, but no, these are basically like action movies. There's like chase scenes and escapes, and, you know, people getting thumbs cut off and stuff like that. You know, people, you know, being accosted in the middle of the night. You know, there's some really exciting bits. There was especially, and some of the, like, set pieces are just, like, really imaginative. There was one especially that I really liked. Yeah, The Adventure of the Engineer's Thumb, which involves, you know, without getting too much into spoilers, it involves this engineer who comes to work on this gigantic press, you know, that these criminals are using for nefarious purposes. And the press is kind of, like, built into this section of the house. And there's this bit where they're, you know, trying to take him out so that he can't, like, reveal anything to anyone by activating the press. And just imagining him, like, standing in this, like, sort of hallway, basically, with this big press coming down, you know, trying to find a way out, you know. It's immensely exciting and imaginative, you know, just this big death trap built into this house, you know. Just stuff like that, man. It's just so much fun. It's so entertaining. And And of course, not to harp on this too much, but the vibes between Holmes and Watson are peak. Holmes is like such a brat. I love him. He's always sort of like talking shit to Watson and kind of insulting him, or just kind of like throwing little temper tantrums because he's like frustrated. Like there's one bit where they're kind of having a little lovers quarrel where Holmes is like kind of annoyed about a case that he's working on, in the beginning of the story, and to sort of like he sort of starts like taking it out on Watson by sort of attacking him for the way that he's depicting everything in his stories, because remember these are supposed to be written from the perspective of Watson, and and he's publishing them for the reading public, and Holmes is kind of like ribbing him about like, oh, you sensationalize things too much, and you should focus purely on like the salient facts and the logic and the way that these conclusions were arrived at, so that people can appreciate sort of the deduction skills of myself and stuff, and they have like a little spat about that. It's just a lot of fun. There's a lot of stuff like that. Again, I mean, it really made me kind of reevaluate the Robert Downey Jr. movie, the first one, more than I already have, because as I said in my previous video, when it first came out, like I was like Holmes isn't like that. Holmes isn't an action hero, and it's like he is. They just didn't necessarily write about it very often, because they mentioned many times he's really strong. He's got a good like punch and stuff like that. He's got baritsu. It's incorrect. It's supposed to be bartitsu, but his sort of judo derived martial art. They just don't necessarily describe the fight scenes. So it was one of those things where it just really surprised me, because as I say, when you tend to think of Holmes and these types of like mystery stories, you tend to think of them as very kind of cozy and chill, and kind of like there's murder, but it's sort of like detached from reality and stuff. And there's elements of that, definitely, with like sort of the, pulling up by the fire at Baker Street and stuff like that and enjoying tea together, But then there's like horrible murders and these like awful crimes and these exciting, action sequences that really kind of pep things up. And it's very easy to read. It flows well. I mean, I just love these, man. I'm so glad I finally got onto this. So thank you, Roy, and everybody else hosting, for putting on this event, getting me motivated back into this. I'm really, really glad I read it, and of course I'm going to continue. I have the next short story collection, the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, next, so very much looking forward to that. So yeah. And then finally another sort of fortuitous read. This is Heated Rivalry by Reid. Everyone's been hearing about this lately. This was just made into a TV series. This is just completely blown up, across the world, which, again, like Legends and Lattes, is why I was intrigued by it, because I'm always interested in, sort of trendsetters, as I say, the things that, like, people talk about that really kind of, like, make an impact. And it's a gay romance novel that got turned into a TV show that, by all accounts from what I've heard, is pretty much just as spicy as the book is. And that's shocking to me, So, of course, as a gay man, I was like, well, I have to read this. I have to see what all the fuss was about. And I'm really glad I did, because, again, I really, really liked it. And, of course, it's also fortuitous. It's February, and I read a romance book, so that, the universe is unfolding as it should, right? So, yeah, I was really, really intrigued by this. And I admit, like, when I started reading this, so I'll explain the plot. It's a hockey romance, obviously. It's these two guys. This is Shane Hollander and Ilya Rozanov. So Shane is sort of a shy, sort of inexperienced in the ways of love, very dedicated hockey player from Canada. Ilya Rozanov is his rival. He's just as good as him, and they're very sort of like intensely focused on each other, and he's sort of a more experienced sort of Russian guy, playing in Boston. Sparks fly pretty much immediately, although kind of in the other direction, where it starts out where as you would expect, a very heated rivalry that gets even more heated when they end up sleeping together, and it turns into this years-long affair where, them sneaking off to hotel room hookups and things like that, and trying not to let anybody else catch on, not only because, to be gay, openly gay in the NHL at this time is basically impossible, and, people would freak out if they found out these two people who are supposed to hate each other are actually fucking. That's the basic plot. And I admit, like, at first I started to kind of struggle with this for about the first first half of the book. It's not that it was bad. it was just that it felt a little bit repetitive. It felt a little bit like they were spinning their wheels a lot, where it's just kind of like hotel room hookup after hotel room hookup after hotel room hookup with not necessarily a lot of variation in sort of what happens and what we learn about the characters and things like that. And then as the second half came around, I really started coming around on it, and as it started delving more into sort of the emotions of the characters and what they were going through and the toll that this was taking on them and how this relationship was deepening in ways that they didn't even realize, to the point where it actually made me appreciate the first half a little bit more, because I realized, oh, we're kind of going on the same journey as the characters, where it's kind of repetitive and samey at first, and they're just, as far as they're concerned, it's just these hotel room hookups. We're just, blowing off some steam after a game or whatever, And then all of a sudden it kind of slowly starts to dawn on them that, oh, this is something deeper, and there's that sort of confusion of like, how did that happen, And that's kind of how it's portrayed in the book, We're kind of going on the same journey. And I really, really liked that. And the way that the relationship sort of slowly, very naturally deepens over time, and the way that it depicts sort of, and I've heard a lot of discourse about this in regards to the show, which I'm very, very curious about after having read the book, because the book is like 70 to 80% fucking, so I'm not exactly sure how that's going to be adapted, but I'm very, very curious to see. But the thing that I love about good smut, in my opinion, is that the sex shouldn't only just be there for titillation. I mean, obviously that's part of it, but it should reveal something about the characters and their relationship to one another and their feelings, and I think this is actually a really well done example of that, especially, as I say, in the way that the emotions kind of just sneak up on the characters. And I also just liked how even throughout the book, as they have all these like deepening feelings for each other, their rivalry is kind of maintained, they're still very like, combative and butting heads all the time, and there's this sense of like, which they go into in the book later on, when they start to open up more to each other, about how, part of the attraction for them is that it's like, you're the best, I'm the best, we have to kind of like, it's like a mutual respect kind of thing, where it's like, nobody else can match us, you know what I mean? It's all us when we're on the ice, and so it's like, it's a pleasure to be able to be challenged by somebody who's just as good as you, and I thought that was mirrored in their relationship really, really well. And of course, there's lots of like snark and banter, that's a lot of fun. And there's really cute moments too, of course, to the point where, as I read more and more of the book, like I was in it, especially later on. There's a scene where they finally have like sort of a heart to heart together on the phone, opening up to each other mostly about most of their feelings. And really kind of like laying it on the line, and by that time, like I was in it, man. I was like yes, like you have to be together, and yeah, it's just very cute, As I say, Shane is kind of like your typical sort of a, very dedicated to the sport, but he's kind of inexperienced in the ways of life and love, but Ilya kind of pulls out this naughtier side of him, sort of that sort of corrupting the good boy type thing that I really enjoyed, and Ilya is kind of, your typical sort of like gruff macho man, with like a soft, tender side, and it's just, I don't know, it's just very, very sweet. I really liked how they depicted certain things like the language barrier, where, in the beginning of the book, Ilya's grasp of English is kind of shaky. And then as the book goes on and, years pass and stuff, he gets a firmer and firmer grasp on it, and that's reflected in the way that the dialogue is written. And even like throughout the book, there's a lot of little things like that where they talk about how sort of, him struggling with like articulating his thoughts and feelings in English, There's several moments where he kind of slips into Russian just to kind of like express himself properly, and just I don't know, it's something I always find very fascinating about, books like this, just interplay of language and trying to form communication. I don't know. I thought it was really, really well done. And to talk briefly about some of those sex scenes, they're very, very well done. They're very sexy. I can't get into details, obviously, but while I said it, it did get a little bit repetitive in the first half of the book, where it's just kind of the same sort of hotel hookup type thing. Later on, as it starts to get more emotional and they start to kind of explore each other more, the author finds a lot more sort of emotional and physical variation. And it ends up just being very sexy and very beautiful. There was one scene in particular that I really, really liked, where they're FaceTiming together, when they're both apart. The way it was done, it was so vivid and just emotional, and just the things that it revealed about their feelings towards each other. I mean, it was so beautifully done, and I could see it so vividly in my head that I was wondering how they, as I said, how they would adapt a lot of this for the show, because it's so explicit. But this was one scene where I could just see it in my head so vividly, and it was just so just gripping that I hope it's as good in the show as it is in my head, but we'll see. There's nothing like super kinky or anything like that, nothing super crazy in terms of what they do, but it's just very, very passionate, very emotional, and as I say, sort of the things that it reveals about the characters and their feelings for each other is what makes them good. So they were very, very satisfying on that count, and in the physical count as well. Just don't go in expecting a crazy panoply of sexual escapades. It's not really that kind of book, but I still very, very satisfying in that respect. I was a little bit curious, because I thought it would go a little bit deeper into some of the themes that it brought up, like the struggle with coming out in the NHL, being gay, not only in the sports world but in Russia, in Ilya's culture. That's not really the focus of it. It really is more about the relationship, and a lot of this sort of other stuff can kind of feel like window dressing sometimes, which could be a knock against it. I've heard that the show goes a little more in depth into some of that. Again, I don't know. But I think it worked, like if you don't go into it expecting it to be sort of this very deep, serious examination of these themes, then I think you'll just enjoy it, and that's what I did, I mean, like I say, like I don't think it's necessarily amazing. I don't know if it's like a 5-star read, but as I sort of like let myself give over into it and get into the emotions and the relationship and stuff, it was just, again, kind of like Legends and Lattes. It was just very pleasant. I don't want to say it was cozy, but there's like cozy moments, and it's that classic romance thing. It's like you want to see people get together, and you want them to get together after a long, hard struggle. It's very cathartic. It's very satisfying. It's very sweet. Yeah, honestly, like, not much to say other than I just thought it was really, really, really well done, and just sweet and fun and tender, and just kind of a nice thing to read, especially for February, I'm definitely very interested to see what the rest of the books are like. It's like, as far as I understand, it's your typical romance series where each book kind of focuses on a different couple within the same world. And I kind of got the sense from some of the side characters that they focused on a little bit that they probably have some of their own books, and depending on which one of those books are about which characters, I'm very intrigued by that. But yeah, I can definitely see why this was such a popular read, and it's just really, really cool, again, to kind of see something like this, this very sexually explicit gay romance novel, that isn't shy about any of the sordid details, to become this like massive success and get a TV show adaptation. I mean, that's unheard of, especially when I was young. When I was in high school, like this would have been like my dream thing, to like see something like that on television, like it's just amazing to me. So I'm just really glad that this is kind of the sort of the Sherpa of gayness, kind of opening that door. It made me happy, and I can tell it made a lot of other people happy too. So I'm definitely intrigued to check out the rest of the books. I will definitely check out the show with my friend Nakia at some point. So yeah, that was just a pleasant time and a really nice one to end on. So yeah. There you go. That was my my reads. I've rambled on a bit as usual, but hopefully you got something out of it, and you were intrigued by any of these. And if you were, let me know. And if you're reading anything interesting, let me know as well. Just chat to me in the comments. But yeah, we'll see what happens. I've got a really busy March coming up. I did want to shout out really quick. Roy from Roy Reads Anything is doing a read-along with Marie Corelli's A Romance Between Two Worlds, sort of a Victorian kind of sensationalist novel. Was a big bestseller in its day, and Michael K. Vaughan is also reading a Marie Corelli book later in May, I believe. So I just wanted to kind of shout that out. If that's something you're interested in, I'll link Roy's channel and everyone's down below. I'm going to have a very busy March, unfortunately. I've got some friends visiting from England, and my birthday and everything. It's just, there's a lot of stuff going on, so I'm not really going to have probably a lot of reading time, but I just wanted to shout it out and just say, that's awesome. Roy and Michael, thank you both for putting on all these events, and Mystery and Mayhem, for doing Holmes is Where the Heart Is, just thank you, everybody, for doing all of these events. I just think it's awesome, and I love all of your videos. I love this little corner of booktube, it's just been really, really nice. So yeah, if you're interested in that, check all those people out, check out their reading events, But yeah, I don't know when I'll be back. Depending on how quickly I read, it might be a little while before my next video, but we'll see. But until next time, I'll see you guys later. Bye.